The smoke reached the ballroom before the alarm did. Hazel Keene was on her knees with a rag in her hand, cleaning up after a charity gala she hadn't been invited to, when a woman in a floor-length gown walked out of the service corridor. She wasn't running. She wasn't coughing. There wasn't a speck of soot on her, and the heel of her left shoe was snapped clean off. She looked Hazel dead in the eye and said, "There's nobody left back there. Get out." Then she walked to the side exit, where a black sedan was already idling. 100 guests poured out the front doors. Hazel went the other way, because under all that noise, she'd heard something that didn't belong, a slow, steady pounding coming up from the basement stairwell, behind a steel door that had been wedged shut from the outside with an iron bar. It took her most of a minute to pry it loose. The man she found at the bottom of those stairs was pinned under a fallen door frame, burning his left hand raw, trying to lift it himself. She didn't ask who he was. She couldn't have lifted him if she'd wanted to. She just got her shoulder under the frame and told him to stand up. 90 seconds later, the ceiling came down. Out in the parking lot, 3 black SUVs arrived before the fire trucks did, and every man who stepped out of them stopped where he stood, because the man a cleaning lady had just dragged out of a burning building was Raymond Castellano, the most powerful man in Chicago. And the woman who'd walked past her without a mark on her, that was his wife. If a story about being seen for who you really are is worth your time, hit that like button and send it to someone. Subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. And now, let's get back to the story. She sat down on the asphalt beside him, her hands still trembling from the strain, and did the only thing she knew to do at that moment. She placed her palm against his chest and counted his breaths. 3 black sport utility vehicles had pulled across the entrance to the lot, blocking it completely. The men who stepped out of them didn't say a word to one another. They spread out in a circle around the place where she sat, stopping about 5 paces away, and remained at precisely that distance. Not one of them came any closer. Not one of them bent down. Hazel looked up at them and realized that an entire circle of grown men was standing there waiting, though what they were waiting for, she couldn't begin to understand. Walter Pike, the old man who looked after the building and had unlocked the basement for the cleaning crew at 10 o'clock every night for the past 4 years, slipped through the circle and came forward. He looked down at the face of the man lying on the asphalt, and every trace of color drained from his own. His lips moved twice, but no sound came out. Only on the 3rd attempt did he manage to speak, and his voice trembled so badly that Hazel had to tilt her head to hear him clearly. "Mr. Castellano." He said nothing more. He stepped back once, then stepped back again, and took his place in the circle with the others. The man on the asphalt opened his eyes. Hazel had braced herself for panic, for violent, choking coughs, for the vacant stare of someone who had just been dragged back from death and hadn't yet understood that he was still alive. He showed none of those things. He studied her for a long moment, slowly and carefully, the way a man might look at a number that had suddenly appeared in a calculation he had checked over and over again and believed couldn't possibly be wrong. There was no gratitude in his eyes. There was something else instead, something closer to suspicion, as though her presence here had just ruined something he had already arranged and settled inside his mind. "You pulled me out," he said. His voice was raw from the smoke, but it remained low and steady, without the slightest trace of urgency. "Because otherwise, you apparently intended to lie there until morning," Hazel replied. She heard someone in the circle draw a sharp breath. The man gave no reaction. He simply continued looking at her for another 2 seconds, then planted his right elbow against the ground and tried to sit up. His left hand was burned so badly that the skin had split apart in patches, but he didn't look at it even once. Only then did the circle break. 3 men rushed forward at the same time. One supported his shoulder, another dropped to his knees beside him, and the 3rd turned and shouted something about an ambulance. Hazel was pushed back about 3 feet, though no one had meant to push her. She got to her feet, retreated several more steps, and let them do what they needed to do. Then she turned to find her crew. They had gathered at the far corner of the parking lot, beside the steel fence separating the property from an empty field, exactly where Mrs. Rosa always made the entire crew stand during every fire drill. Hazel began to count. She counted from habit, following the same order Mrs. Rosa always used when calling their names at the start of a shift. And she counted 10 people. She counted again. There were still 10. Toby Marsh sat on the curb with both arms wrapped around his knees, and the boy, only 19 years old, looked up when he saw her approaching. He had escaped through the garbage truck entrance on the north side, he told her. He had run outside the moment he smelled something burning, even before the alarm sounded. He asked Hazel whether everyone had made it out. Hazel didn't answer him. She walked along the line of people once more, looking into every face. And this time, she didn't count. She was searching for only one face. Mrs. Rosa Delgado wasn't there. Hazel started walking back toward the building. She had gone about 50 feet when a firefighter stopped her by holding one arm across her chest and ordered her to remain behind the line. She told him there was still someone inside, that her name was Rosa, that she had gone back in to look for a boy, and that the door in the kitchen corridor had to be pulled, not pushed. The firefighter nodded, repeated that final detail into his radio, then kept Hazel behind the line. Hazel remained exactly where she was. She stood there when the eastern wall collapsed. She stood there when they placed the man whose left hand had been hastily bandaged into a black car instead of an ambulance, and the car left the parking lot before the paramedics could record his name on their chart. She was still standing there close to 4 o'clock in the morning when 2 firefighters emerged through the service entrance, and one of them removed his helmet. They had found Mrs. Rosa in the corridor leading from the kitchen to the western emergency exit. She had been lying 11 steps from the door. Hazel didn't cry. She asked whether they were certain it was her, and they said they were. She asked whether anything had happened to her, and they said there was nothing except the smoke. Then Hazel thanked them, just as someone might thank another person for returning something they had dropped. And she went back to the steel fence to tell the remaining 9 people. Toby was the last person she spoke to. The boy asked why Mrs. Rosa had gone back inside, and Hazel looked at him for a long moment before answering that she had gone back because one person was missing when she counted. She didn't tell him who that person was. She made that decision in the silence between those 2 sentences, and she would keep it to herself for a while longer. She reached her room above the laundromat close to 6 o'clock and turned on the television because there was no other sound in the apartment. The morning news led with the fire at the Verona Social Club in Bridgeport. They said one person had died, that the victim hadn't yet been identified, and that they were awaiting the medical examiner's findings. Then they moved to the main story, the part where the anchor lowered his voice by a measured degree, saying that Mrs. Vivian Castellano had now been declared missing, that she had attended the fundraiser the previous night, that according to witnesses she hadn't left the building with the other guests, and that the authorities still hadn't found a body. The photograph they showed on the screen had been taken at a charity event the year before. Her hair was swept high, and she was smiling just enough that no one could accuse her of being cold. Hazel set her glass of water on the table. She stared at the photograph as the anchor read the final sentence, then reached over, turned off the television, and sat motionless in the darkness for a long while. She remembered the heel that had snapped clean off the shoe, the black leather case, and the way that woman had looked straight into her eyes and said there was no one left in the back. Hazel didn't tell anyone about it for the next 3 days because she didn't know whom to tell, and because every time she thought about opening her mouth, the same question rose inside her mind. Who would believe a woman who scrubbed floors for a living? Those 3 days passed in a string of telephone calls. No one answered. The cleaning company was called Lakeshore Facility Services, and its switchboard transferred her to Human Resources, which transferred her to an extension that rang 8 times before disconnecting on its own. It wasn't until the afternoon of the 3rd day that a woman in the administrative office finally answered, and she spoke to Hazel in the calm, even voice of someone reading words that had already been written for her. She said Hazel's crew hadn't contracted directly with Lakeshore. Lakeshore held the cleaning contract for the Verona Social Club, then turned the work over to a subcontractor called Midway Cleaning Group. And Midway, paid by the hour, paid by check, didn't report the wages for tax purposes, didn't issue Form W-2, and didn't carry workers' compensation insurance. Therefore, Lakeshore was very sorry, but there was no legal basis for the company to make any payment whatsoever. Hazel asked about the death benefit. The woman on the other end of the line fell silent for several seconds, then asked whose death benefit she meant. Hazel gave her Mrs. Rosa Delgado's name, spelling every letter twice. She heard the clatter of a keyboard. Then the woman said their system showed no record of any employee by that name ever having worked at that address. It wasn't that she had left the job. It wasn't that her file had been lost. She had never existed. Hazel thanked the woman and ended the call, then sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the telephone in the palm of her hand for a while. For 4 years, Hazel had known the names of everyone in that building. She knew the night guard had diabetes and always kept candy in his desk drawer, knew the receptionist on the 1st floor was getting married, and knew Walter Pike liked his coffee weak. That morning, she learned that the building had never known her name. Late that afternoon, Marisol called her. Mrs. Rosa's daughter was 23 years old, and her voice sounded as though she had cried for 3 days and then stopped because she no longer had the strength. In a very calm voice, she asked Hazel whether she knew of an inexpensive funeral home. She said the first funeral home had quoted her $8,400, the second had quoted $7,200, and the account she shared with her mother held a little more than $1,100. She said she had asked the parish for help, and the priest had agreed to conduct the service free of charge, but the parish couldn't cover anything else. Hazel told her to choose the most decent place she could afford, then read out her bank account number and told her to take $600 first, every dollar Hazel had in the bank at that moment. Marisol refused. Hazel told her this wasn't something she was allowed to refuse. That evening, Marisol created an online fundraising page called Help Me Bring My Mother Home and included a photograph of Mrs. Rosa standing in her own kitchen, holding a ladle and laughing because someone beyond the frame had just said something funny. The goal was $7,500. Hazel sent the link to the other 9 members of the crew, and on the first night, they raised $480. The next day brought another $230. The day after that brought another $95. Hazel opened the page at the end of every night shift, and she began to understand something she didn't want to say aloud to Marisol. At that rate, it would take the girl nearly 2 months, and the funeral home wouldn't keep a body for more than 10 days. She was trying to work out whom she might borrow from and how much more each person might lend her when her telephone vibrated with a call from an unfamiliar number, and the person on the other end asked whether she was a co-worker of Toby Marsh. The caller was the landlady of the boarding house where Toby rented a room, and she said the police had come that morning to collect his belongings, that they were holding him at the Cook County Jail, and that she had called Hazel because her name was the only one listed in his emergency contact book. Hazel asked what he had been charged with. The woman said she wasn't sure. She had only overheard the word arson. Hazel took the first train the following morning, arrived at the jail at 7:15, and stood in line with 40 other people in a pale green corridor until it was her turn at the reception counter. The person behind the glass asked what her relationship was to the inmate. Hazel said she was his coworker. The person looked at her over a pair of glasses and said that only immediate family members were permitted to visit or receive information about the case, that Hazel's name wasn't on any list, and that if the young man didn't have an attorney, the court would appoint a public defender. Hazel asked when. The person said within 48 hours, usually. Hazel asked if she could leave him a message. The person said no. She remained in front of the glass for a little while longer, not knowing what else to say, until someone behind her spoke up to remind her that others were waiting, and she stepped aside. At the row of waiting room chairs at the end of the corridor, a man sat reading a form. He looked up when he saw her standing there in a daze, then told her that if it was a fire, they were looking for a cause, and the quickest way to find one was to find a cigarette butt. There was no malice in the way he said it. He spoke as though he were simply giving directions to someone who had lost her way. That afternoon, Hazel called 3 law offices. The first quoted a retainer of $7,500. The second didn't take criminal cases. The third asked what her relationship was to the defendant, and when she answered, the lawyer said he was very sorry, but he needed the signature of a family member. That evening, she returned to her room, locked the door, and took down the tin cookie box from the top of the cabinet. Inside were $320 in cash, divided into 2 stacks, her mother's wedding ring, and an envelope with worn corners. She counted the money twice. She had sent Marisol $600 the week before, and those $320 were all she had left. She opened the envelope even though she knew the number inside by heart. Rush University Medical Center listed an outstanding balance of $61,240 for 14 months of treatment provided to Mrs. Deirdre Keene. And at the bottom was a line of small print stating that the debt had been transferred to a collection agency. Beneath that envelope, at the bottom of the box, lay a student identification card from Loyola University Chicago's School of Nursing, bearing a photograph of Hazel at 24, her hair tied high, and an expiration date that had passed 4 years earlier. Hazel picked up the card, turned it once in her hand, then returned it to its place and closed the lid. She had studied for 3.5 years, attending classes during the day and working nights, and she had left in the middle of the fall semester of her final year, the year her mother fell in the bathroom and couldn't stand up again. She had never told anyone about it, Not even Mrs. Rosa, who had taken her onto the crew 2 weeks after her mother's funeral without asking a single question. She returned the box to the top of the cabinet, took a shower, then lay down and couldn't sleep. She thought about Toby, 19 years old, sitting somewhere inside that pale green building, waiting for an attorney he had never met. She thought about the fact that he still didn't know whom Mrs. Rosa had gone back inside to find. And she thought about the woman with the broken heel, about the way she had left through the side door instead of the main entrance, and about one detail Hazel hadn't told anyone, that the steel door leading down to the basement had been wedged shut from the outside that night. She finally drifted to sleep close to 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 5th day after the fire, just as she had returned from her night shift, and was standing in the kitchen waiting for the water to boil. Someone knocked at the door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced and unhurried. The outside staircase leading to her room rose from the alley behind the laundromat, and in the 4 years she had lived there, no one had ever knocked on her door at that hour. Hazel looked through the peephole. The man standing outside appeared to be about 45 years old. His hair was cut short, and he wore a dark coat. He stood perfectly straight, his arms resting at his sides and his open palms turned forward, in the precise posture of someone who wanted the person inside to see that he wasn't holding anything. He didn't knock again. He merely stood there, facing the door, and waited. Hazel released the safety latch but left the chain in place, then opened the door about 8 inches. "Hazel Keene," he said. It wasn't a question. "My name is Silas Renner. I'm here on behalf of the man you pulled from the basement of the Verona Social Club." He paused for a moment. "Put on your coat. The car is waiting in the alley." Hazel didn't move. She asked where he was taking her, and Renner looked at her through the narrow opening with the expression of a man calculating exactly how much of the truth he ought to reveal. "That," he said, "isn't for me to decide." The car traveled north for more than an hour, leaving the city behind and following a 2-lane road lined on both sides with bare oak trees, then turned onto a private drive nearly 1/4 of a mile long and stopped in front of a 3-story gray stone house in Lake Forest, the kind of house Hazel had only ever seen in photographs hanging in the waiting rooms of real estate firms. Renner didn't say a word during the entire drive. A woman of about 35 opened the door, introduced herself as Claire Bennett, and led Hazel upstairs to the 2nd floor, along a hallway covered in carpeting so thick that it swallowed every footstep. She pointed to a door and said he was waiting for her. Hazel placed her hand on the knob and realized it wasn't locked. She also noticed that at the far end of the hallway, near the turn leading down to the stairs, a man stood leaning against the wall with his arms folded across his chest. He wasn't openly looking at her, yet he never once let her out of his sight. Hazel understood then that this door had no need for a lock. Inside was a spacious study, with dark wood-paneled walls and a large window overlooking a lawn veiled in mist, with the lake lying far beyond it. Raymond Castellano sat behind the desk, dressed in a black shirt without a tie. His left hand was completely wrapped in bandages from the tips of his fingers to above his wrist, and rested palm up on the desk like a separate object that didn't belong to him. The cut along his left cheekbone had been closed with 3 stitches. He didn't rise. He merely tipped his chin toward the chair across from him, and Hazel sat down. "Tell me what you saw," he said. "From the moment you smelled smoke until the moment you pried that door open." Hazel placed both hands in her lap. She had spent the past 5 days arranging this exact sequence in her mind, and now she recited it as though she were reading an inventory at the end of a shift. The smell of smoke came about 40 seconds before the fire alarm sounded. A woman in a long gown emerged from the service corridor. She wasn't running. Her strides were long but even. She wasn't coughing. Not even once. There was no soot on her hair, her face, her shoulders, or either sleeve. There was no ash, nothing at all. Her dress wasn't torn. The heel of her left shoe had snapped clean off, leaving only the front, so every step on her left side fell lower than the one on her right, and Hazel noticed because she had cleaned that floor for 4 years and knew the sound of heels against it. In her left hand, the woman carried a black leather briefcase with a combination lock, and she held it pressed against her hip instead of letting it hang at her side. She looked Hazel straight in the eyes and said there was no one left in the back and that Hazel should get outside. Then she left through the eastern side door, not the main entrance. And outside that door, a black sedan was already running with its lights off, parked facing outward toward the road. Hazel hadn't seen the license plate. After that, she went back inside. At the landing leading down to the basement, the steel door had been barred with an iron crosspiece. the kind used to assemble warehouse shelving, about 4 feet long. It had been threaded through the door handle, with both ends braced against the 2 sides of the wall. The iron bar was on the outside of the door. That meant someone had stood in the hallway and placed it there. It took Hazel about 50 seconds to pry it loose because she had to find a chair to brace her foot against. Hazel stopped. She had told him everything. Raymond didn't ask another question. He sat motionless, staring down at the surface of the desk, and the silence stretched on so long that Hazel could hear the clock on the wall and the wind beyond the window. He didn't frown. He didn't clench his hand. He didn't ask her to repeat a single detail, not even about the briefcase, not even about the car. When he finally looked up, his face remained exactly as it had been when she first entered the room. "Do you know who you just described?" he asked. Hazel met his gaze. "No," she answered, "but you do." Renner, who had been standing in the corner near the door from the beginning, stepped half a pace forward. "Sir, she's the only witness," he said, his voice low and quick. "The police haven't taken her statement, and if this gets out before we know what's happening, she'll be the first person they come looking for. I recommend moving her out of the state. I have a place in Wisconsin. 3 weeks, someone to watch over her, and no one will be able to trace her. After that, it's up to you." Raymond listened to all of it. He didn't look at Renner while the man spoke. He kept his eyes on Hazel, and when Renner finished, he continued watching her for several more seconds. "She stays," he said, "and no one is to touch her." Renner opened his mouth as though he intended to say something more. Then he closed it again, gave a single nod, and said nothing. In that moment, Hazel understood that she had just witnessed something final, that in this room there was no argument, no persuasion, no returning to the matter for further discussion the following morning. Raymond pushed back his chair and rose, bracing himself against the desk with his right hand, and she saw that he was placing all his weight on that side. "You'll stay here," he told her. "For how long, I don't know yet. Mrs. Bennett will arrange a room for you." Hazel rose as well. She thought of the tin box on top of her cabinet, of the $320 inside it, of Toby waiting for an attorney who still hadn't appeared, and she said the only thing she could think of at that moment, "I still have my night shift on Monday." Raymond looked at her. "No," he said, "you don't." Claire Bennett took her to a room in the east wing with a double bed, a private bathroom, and a window overlooking a row of trees, and said breakfast was served at 7 o'clock in the small dining room, and that if Hazel needed anything, she could press the button beside the bed. Hazel stood in the middle of the room, with her coat still on, and said she didn't need anything, but she did need something to do. Claire studied her for a moment, then asked her to explain. Hazel said she wasn't accustomed to sitting idle, that she had worked without stopping since she was 17, and that if she was expected to lie in that room for 4 weeks and wait for other people to decide her fate, she would lose her mind. Then she added one more thing, more slowly, saying that she didn't want to owe anyone for a meal she couldn't repay. Claire asked no further questions. The next morning, she left a neatly folded charcoal gray uniform on the dining table, along with a sheet listing the work schedule and hourly wage, and explained that the household cleaning crew consisted of 6 people, that they began work at 6 o'clock in the morning, and that the woman responsible for the second floor was on maternity leave. Hazel accepted the job that very morning. The work wasn't much different from what she had done for 4 years at the Verona Social Club. There was simply less dust and a greater number of fragile things. She cleaned the second floor hallway from one end to the other, vacuumed the carpet lengthwise and then across, wiped the wooden stairs with a damp cloth, and went over them again with a dry one. Raymond's study was cleaned at 6:15, before he came downstairs, and from the first day, Hazel followed a precise order of her own making. She opened the curtains, she gathered the cups and glasses onto a tray. She wiped the surface of the desk from the left edge to the right, lifting every object and placing it back exactly where it had been, and she did it carefully because she knew that men like the owner of this house often remembered the position of their belongings down to the last inch. She lifted the paperclip holder and set it down again. She picked up the steel seal embosser belonging to Castellano Holdings, the heavy tool shaped like the letter C that was pressed together to stamp the image of an eagle into paper, cleaned the surface beneath it, and returned it to its place. On the steel die, along the eagle's left wing, there was a chip, about 1/25 of an inch long. She continued cleaning the rest of the desk, emptied the ashtray, changed the water in the flower vase, and left the room before 6:30. She did exactly the same thing every morning. In the evenings, she returned to the room in the east wing, sat on the edge of the bed, and checked Marisol's fundraising page. By the 9th day, the amount had stalled at $2,170. She called Marisol twice a week to ask whether she was eating properly, but she didn't tell the girl where she was. She also called the Cook County Court every Tuesday and Thursday morning to ask about Toby Marsh's court date, and each time, the person answering the telephone read her the same line, saying that the case remained under investigation and that no court date had yet been set. The strangest thing about that house wasn't its wealth. It was the speed with which Hazel disappeared. On the first day, people still glanced at her. On the second, 2 guards stopped talking when she pushed her supply cart past them. On the third, they lowered their voices but continued their conversation. By the 4th day, they no longer lowered their voices at all. Hazel knelt to clean the baseboards in the first-floor hallway, less than 10 feet from where they stood, while they discussed how the police still hadn't finished dredging the area along the southern embankment, how the family on the wife's side had sent people over 2 days earlier, and how someone inside the house was feeding information to outsiders. One of them said someone would have to pay for what had happened. The other said it wasn't for the 2 of them to discuss. Then they went outside to smoke, and neither man looked back at her even once. At noon that same day, 2 women in the kitchen talked directly in front of her while she washed a flower vase in the sink beside them. They said a shoe had been found on the lawn behind the social club, that it was a woman's high-heeled shoe, and that the authorities still hadn't disclosed it to the press. Hazel didn't turn her head. She finished washing the vase, placed it upside down on the rack, wiped her hands on her apron, and went upstairs to complete the rest of her afternoon work. She had lived for 11 years in this condition. The state people called being there without truly being present, and she knew exactly what it cost and what it offered in return. It took from her the feeling that she deserved to be seen by anyone. In exchange, it allowed her to hear everything. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Hazel was folding towels in the linen room at the end of the hallway when she heard the family's private physician speaking from inside the study, his voice louder than was usual for a man conducting a medical examination. "Doctor, Ellis Novak said there were deep second-degree burns across the back of the hand and wrist. Said that if infection set in, Raymond could lose all function in the extensor tendons. Said that both the 7th and 8th ribs were fractured, and said 10 days, no going anywhere, no meetings, no getting into a car." Raymond's reply was so brief that Hazel had to stand completely still to hear it. 4 days. Novak said he couldn't bargain with broken ribs. Raymond said 4 days, and then there was silence. And that silence ended the negotiation. Before leaving, Novak stopped at the door and asked who would change the dressing twice a day, because he couldn't drive up from Evanston 2 times every day. Claire Bennett, standing in the hallway, said there was someone in the house who had studied nursing. Hazel looked up and found both of them watching her. She said she had studied for 3.5 years, that she didn't have a degree, and that she had never taken the licensing examination, making every part of that clear before either of them had a chance to ask. Novak asked if she knew how to irrigate a burn with saline and apply a silver dressing. She said she did. He opened his bag and placed a box of silver-impregnated gauze, a bottle of saline, and a jar of ointment on the table, then instructed her to remove the old dressing every evening, wash away the drainage, leave any skin that had adhered in place, apply fresh gauze, and wrap it loosely. He added that if she saw redness spreading beyond the edges of the burn or noticed any odor, she was to call him immediately, even in the middle of the night. Then he left. On the first evening, Hazel knocked on the study door at 9 o'clock, carrying a tray and a small basin. Raymond was sitting in the armchair beside the window instead of behind his desk, and only one lamp was lit. He placed his hand on the towel she had already spread across the armrest, and he didn't say a word for the next 20 minutes. Hazel worked slowly. She unwound the bandage 1 layer at a time, soaking the innermost layer with saline so it would release on its own instead of pulling it away. And she looked at his face 3 times while she worked, exactly 3 times, because she needed to know whether she was being too rough. He didn't groan. He didn't pull his hand away. The only thing that betrayed him was his breathing, which grew shorter and shallower for about 40 seconds when she cleaned the area where the drainage had dried, then returned to its steady rhythm. When she finished, she asked if he wanted pain medication. He said no. The second night was the same, and on the third night, he began to speak. He asked what neighborhood she lived in. She said Pilsen, above a laundromat. He asked what year her mother had died. Hazel's hands paused for about a second before she said 4 years ago, then added that she assumed Renner had already reported everything to him. Raymond didn't deny it. On the 4th night, while she was wrapping the final layer of bandage, someone knocked at the door, and a man leaned his head inside and said the Ashford family had called again, that they were asking about the progress of the search and wanted to be present at the meeting with the police. Raymond said it could wait until tomorrow. The man withdrew. Hazel finished wrapping the bandage, secured the clip, and asked a question she had been considering for 3 nights. The Ashfords are your wife's family? Yes. Do they have the right to make those demands? Raymond looked out the window. Yes, he said. That marriage was an agreement. When I was 29, my father died in February, and I took his place in March. By September, the 2 families sat down together, and the only way to end what was happening at the time was a wedding. She was 25. We were married 3 weeks later. He said it in the voice of a man reciting the terms of a contract rather than recounting his own life. It's been 9 years. Hazel gathered the soiled gauze into a plastic bag, tied it closed, and placed it on the tray. She asked her next question, while still looking down, without meeting his eyes, in precisely the way people asked something when they weren't certain they had the right to ask it. What about her? What did she want? Raymond didn't answer at once. Hazel looked up and saw that he was still gazing through the window into the darkness beyond, and in that interval, she had time to hear the clock tick 15 times. I never asked, he said. He said it plainly, as though answering a question about the weather on a day that had passed long ago, and immediately afterward, he turned his wrist to see whether the bandage was too tight. You do a neater job than Novak, he said. Hazel lifted the tray and rose. She wished him good night, left the room, closed the door behind her, and walked down the darkened hallway toward the stairs. The following morning was the 5th day since Novak had ordered him to rest, and when Hazel came downstairs to clean the study at 6:15, Raymond's coat was no longer hanging on the rack. A car door was closing in the courtyard, and on the desk lay a handwritten note for Claire instructing her to move all the afternoon appointments to the first-floor conference room because he would be returning late. He returned close to 10 o'clock that night, and Hazel went upstairs to change his dressing later than usual. The entire time, she said nothing beyond the few words that were necessary. She finished, fastened the clip, placed the soiled gauze in the bag, lifted the tray, and walked toward the door. She put her hand on the doorknob, then stopped. She stood there for about 3 seconds with her back to him, and in those 3 seconds, she thought of every time in all her 28 years when she had stood in this exact position, her hand already resting on a doorknob, and had chosen to walk away. She set the tray down on the small table beside the door and turned around. I'm asking you for 3 minutes, she said. Raymond said nothing. He merely looked at her, and she understood that he had agreed. Over the next few weeks, people will sit in this chair and report to you about the Verona Social Club, she said. They'll talk about the insurance money. They'll talk about construction contractors, permits, schedules, and which quarter the club can reopen. There'll be numbers. There'll be charts. I'm sure they're very good at what they do, but no one, not a single one of them, will report to you about the 11 people who cleaned that building for 4 years but, according to the paperwork, never once set foot inside it, because they don't exist in any system from which a report could be made. The company that received the contract handed the work over to a subcontractor, and the subcontractor paid cash by the hour, with no reported taxes, no accident insurance, nothing at all. I called them. They searched for Rosa Delgado's name in the system and told me that no employee by that name had ever worked at that address. She cleaned those floors for 19 years, before I did, before the social club changed owners twice. Hazel paused, not to catch her breath, but to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Rosa had already made it outside that night. She stood by the fence and counted everyone in the same order she always called their names at the end of a shift. And she came up 1 person short, so she went back inside. The firefighters found her in the kitchen corridor, 11 steps from the western emergency exit. The person she went back to find was Toby Marsh. He's 19 years old, and he had already gotten out through the northern garbage truck entrance. To this day, he still doesn't know she went back inside because of him. I'm the one who decided not to tell him, and I still haven't figured out whether that was right or wrong. Mrs. Rosa's daughter is Marisol. She's 23 years old. The funeral home quoted her $7,200. She had $1,100. 2 weeks ago, She created an online fundraising page called Help Me Bring My Mother Home. And as of this morning, she had raised $2,170. The funeral home will hold a body for no more than 10 days. Toby is sitting in the Cook County Detention Center. They say he discarded a cigarette butt. He doesn't smoke. I worked beside him for 2 years, and he has asthma. But the police need a cause for the fire, and a 19-year-old cleaner working off the books, with no money to hire an attorney, is the cheapest cause they could find. I went to the jail. They wouldn't let me see him because I'm not family. I called 3 law offices. The least expensive one demanded a retainer of $7,500 and required the signature of a relative. But Toby doesn't have a single relative in this state. She looked directly at him. I didn't come here to ask for money for myself. I came because you're the only person I've ever met whose one telephone call could accomplish what the 9 of us couldn't manage after pooling everything we have for an entire month. And because if I don't tell you tonight, no one else ever will. She read every name aloud. Rosa Delgado, Marisol Delgado, Toby Marsh. Then she read the remaining 8 names from the crew, slowly and distinctly, as though calling attendance at the end of a shift. Ivan Petrick, Lucia Ramos, Bogdan Hasek, Maria Elena Cruz, Denny Fagan, Yelena Rusk, Oscar Villalobos, Kathleen Doyle. She told him which of them had young children, which of them rented their homes 1 month at a time, and which one had a herniated disc but didn't dare take a day off. She told him everything in about 4 minutes, never raising her voice once. Then she fell silent. Raymond remained motionless in the armchair, his left hand resting palm up on the towel, and he hadn't interrupted her a single time from beginning to end. He didn't ask her to repeat a name. He didn't ask her to repeat a number. When she finished, he allowed the silence to stretch a little longer, and Hazel remained where she was, her arms hanging at her sides, waiting for him to say what she had already expected to hear, that he would have someone look into it, that he would consult the legal department, that the matter was more complicated than she understood. "I'll take care of it," he said. That was all. He added nothing else, didn't ask how much she needed, didn't promise a deadline, and didn't explain how he intended to do it. Hazel stood there a moment longer, then picked up the tray, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. She closed the door very softly behind her. She had made it halfway down the corridor when her knees began to tremble, and she had to stop and lean her shoulder against the wall for a while before she could continue toward the stairs. 3 days later, the first-floor conference room was closed from 9 o'clock in the morning and didn't open again until nearly noon. Hazel wasn't inside. She cleaned the second-floor hallway as she did every morning, and she learned what had happened only through the fragments the entire household gathered and passed among themselves in the kitchen, in the garage, and at the smoking spot behind the low wall. Silas Renner entered the conference room carrying a folder, accompanied by 3 other men. He placed the preliminary findings from the Chicago Fire Department's Fire Investigation Unit on the table, and the first finding was that the fire hadn't been an accident. It had started at 2 separate points, about 30 feet apart in the kitchen's dry storage room, and traces of a petroleum-based accelerant had been found at both locations. A fire caused by a discarded cigarette would never have 2 points of origin. The second finding concerned the cameras. The 4 cameras covering the service corridor, the basement landing, and the eastern side door had stopped recording at 10:41 that night, and they hadn't malfunctioned or lost power. They had been shut down by a command, entered remotely through an internal Castellano Holdings administrator account. No one had hacked into the system from outside. Someone with the password had been sitting somewhere, typed in the command, and pressed confirm. Renner said that narrowed the people who needed to be investigated down to 19. Then he opened the second folder. Over the previous 6 months, 4 transfers had been made out of the United States, totaling $2,300,000. The money had passed through a chain of accounts in Curacao before ending at a company registered in Valletta, Malta, called Adriatic Coastal Holdings, which had been established 2 years earlier. The only name listed on the company's registration documents was Vincent Farrow. There were 4 people in the conference room at that moment, and according to what one of them later recounted, no one said a word for about 10 seconds. Vincent Farrow was 63 years old. He had been with the Castellano family for 35 years. He was the man who had carried Raymond around the backyard during the summer Raymond turned 3, the man who taught him to drive when he was 16, the man who stood beside his father's coffin and held Raymond by the elbow throughout the entire funeral. He was the only person in the organization permitted to call Raymond by his first name in front of outsiders. Renner continued, his voice slower now, saying there was one more thing. 2 days earlier, an old contact in Cicero had reported that someone had seen a woman leaving a rental house on Austin Street late in the afternoon, her hair cut shorter, glasses on her face, accompanied by an unfamiliar man, before getting into a car with no license plates parked out front. The informant couldn't be 100% certain, but he had seen her from about 33 feet away, and her face had appeared on every news report for the past 2 weeks beneath the words currently believed to be dead. Cicero, Renner said, was Emil Kovac's territory. Renner left the folder open on the table and stepped back half a pace. None of the other 3 men spoke. The person who later recounted what happened said the most unsettling part wasn't what had been revealed, but the fact that the boss did nothing at all. Raymond remained seated at the head of the table, his bandaged left hand resting in his lap, and read the first page to the end, then turned to the second, then the third, reading each one from top to bottom at exactly the same pace. He didn't strike the table. He didn't spring to his feet. He didn't ask a single question, not even the one all 4 men in the room were waiting to hear, whether it was truly her. When he finished the final page, he closed the folder and placed his right hand over it. According to the man who told the story, the temperature in the room dropped at that exact moment, though no one could explain how. "Bring Pharaoh here," Raymond said. 3 words, nothing more. Renner asked when, and Raymond said to bring him once he had finished his business in Rockford. There was no need to hurry, and no need to tell him why. One of the men in the room asked whether they should increase security around the house. Raymond said yes, then added that whoever guarded the 2nd floor had to be one of Renner's men, not someone new. Then he stood and left the room. By noon, the entire household knew something serious had happened, though no one knew precisely what it was. Hazel heard 3 different fragments over the course of 3 hours, and none of them fit together, but she clearly heard something 2 guards said to each other at the foot of the stairs, when they believed the hallway above them was empty. One man said, 35 years. The other said, yes, 35 years, then fell silent for a while before adding that if it could be him, it could be anyone. That afternoon, Hazel cleaned the study later than usual. Nothing on the desk was different from any other day, and she followed the same familiar order, lifting each object and returning it to exactly the same place. As she left, she saw Raymond standing at the far end of the hallway with his back to her, gazing down at the lawn through the large window, and he remained there for a very long time, alone, doing nothing at all. 12 days after the night Hazel stood at the study door, Toby Marsh walked out of the Cook County Detention Center at 11:20 on Thursday morning. No one had told Hazel in advance. She learned about it when Marisol called her near noon, the girl's voice sounding strange, and said that an attorney named Gallagher had submitted footage to the prosecutor's office from the security camera at the gas station across from the Verona Social Club. The footage showed Toby leaving through the northern garbage truck entrance at 10:36 that night, 5 minutes before the cameras inside the building were shut down and 15 minutes before the fire broke out. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office dropped every charge that same morning and included a stamped, 1-page letter stating that the case against Mr. Marsh was closed and that his record would be expunged. Toby held that letter in his hand the entire way home without putting it in his pocket. And when he reached the boarding house, he sat on the front steps and read it 4 more times. 3 days later, someone from the law office came to see him and handed him an admission letter for a refrigeration and ventilation systems technician training program at a trade school on the west side of the city. The program lasted 10 months, and the full tuition had been covered by a scholarship fund, along with the cost of his tools and a transportation allowance. Toby asked who had paid for it. The man said the fund didn't disclose the identities of its donors. Rosa Delgado's funeral was held on Saturday morning at St. Barbara Church in Bridgeport, the same church where she had attended Mass for 19 years. The funeral home had been paid in full on Tuesday, and Marisol was informed that the complete payment also included a burial plot at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, the kind with a granite headstone rather than a flat bronze marker set into the grass. Marisol asked for the online fundraising page to be closed, and she returned the money to everyone who had contributed. On the Monday morning after the funeral, a woman in a suit came to the girl's home, placed a folder of documents on the kitchen table, and slowly explained everything to her twice. The single-story house on South Wallace Street that Rosa had rented for 19 years had been purchased from its former owner and paid for in full, with no mortgage and no debt, and the deed now bore the name Marisol Delgado. Alongside it was a trust established in the girl's name, with monthly payments for 10 years, enough for her to finish college without having to leave before graduating for any reason. Marisol asked who had done this. The woman said she had only been authorized to deliver the documents. During that same week, all 11 members of the cleaning crew received letters inviting them to an office in the Loop. One by one, they were called inside, and one by one, they emerged with employment contracts signed directly with the property management company owned by Castellano Holdings. Their hourly wage was $1.25 higher than before. They had Form W-2 tax documentation, health insurance beginning on their first day rather than after a 90-day probationary period, workers' compensation coverage, paid vacation, and death benefits. 3 of them didn't have valid residency papers, and each of those 3 was spoken to privately, referred to an immigration law office whose fees had already been paid, and hired while their cases were being processed. Kathleen Doyle, the oldest member of the crew, sat in the hallway after signing her contract and couldn't bring herself to stand for 10 full minutes. That Saturday morning, Hazel arrived at St. Barbara Church 15 minutes early. She had finished cleaning every window in the second-floor hallway, beginning at 6 o'clock that morning, because she didn't want to leave the work for someone else, and she had gone directly from there to the car, so when she sat down in the last pew, her hands still smelled of glass cleaner. The church was crowded. She recognized 9 members of the crew scattered among the middle rows, saw Toby sitting in the 4th pew, and saw Walter Pike sitting alone near the aisle. Marisol stood in the front row wearing a black coat, and the girl held herself upright throughout the entire service. Hazel didn't move closer to the front. She remained in the last pew with her hands resting in her lap, and she didn't cry. She stood when everyone else stood, sat when everyone else sat, and sang along in a voice so quiet that even the person beside her couldn't hear it. When the procession began moving out, she stepped aside to let everyone pass, and Marisol saw her standing there. The girl said nothing. She simply walked over, wrapped her arms tightly around Hazel for 3 seconds, then let go, and continued with the procession. Hazel went out to the car. The Castellano family's driver was waiting at the curb across the street, and she told him she wanted to sit alone for a little while. He nodded and walked to the end of the block. Hazel climbed into the car, closed the door, and cried there alone for exactly 15 minutes. She made no sound as she wept, both hands gripping the steering wheel even though she wasn't the one who drove. Then she opened her purse, took out a tissue, wiped her face, blew her nose, folded the tissue, and slipped it into her coat pocket. She checked her face in the rearview mirror, smoothed the hair on both sides of her head, then stepped out of the car and called the driver back. She didn't say a word on the journey home to Lake Forest. That afternoon, she finished wiping down the second-floor stair rail, and she told no one in that house what had happened. On Monday morning, Claire Bennett informed the cleaning crew that the boss had gone to Miami and would be away for 10 days. Hazel cleaned the study as usual at 6:15, and she did the same thing for 2 more mornings. On Wednesday afternoon, Silas Renner found her in the second-floor hallway. He didn't waste time with explanations. He said the situation was stable now, that there was no longer any reason to keep her there, and that a car would take her back to Pilsen in 2 hours. Hazel listened to everything, then asked only one question, whether he knew about this. Renner said he carried out the instructions he was given. Hazel folded the charcoal gray uniform into a neat square and placed it on the bed, washed the plastic basin she had used for changing the dressing, and set it upside down on a shelf in the linen closet, then went downstairs carrying the same cloth bag she had brought with her on the first day, still exactly as light as it had been when she arrived. Claire Bennett was standing in the foyer. She took Hazel's hand for a moment, then let it go without saying anything. In the car, Renner handed her a thick craft paper envelope with nothing written on the outside. He said it belonged to her. Hazel didn't open it for the entire journey. She reached the alley behind the laundromat at nearly 7 o'clock that evening, climbed the outside stairs, unlocked her door, and stood in the middle of the room for a while because the air inside now carried the smell of a place that had been shut for a long time. She opened the window, plugged in the kettle, then sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope. Inside was cash arranged in 6 stacks and a small piece of paper, with the amount written out in words, $60,000. Hazel sat motionless for a very long time. Then she stood, reached for the tin box on top of the wardrobe, opened the lid, took out the envelope with the worn corners, and placed the 2 things side by side on the table. The hospital statement showed an outstanding balance of $61,240. She looked at those two figures for a while, then understood that someone had found the exact amount and rounded it down, and she also understood that the difference of $1,240 was the portion they had left for her to pay herself, whether deliberately or not. The following morning, she called the collection agency. They told her to come to the branch on Wacker Street, bring identification, and make the payment through a bank because they didn't accept cash. It took her 2 days to divide the money into smaller amounts and deposit it into her account. Then another day for the bank to verify the source of the funds, and by Monday afternoon of the following week, she was sitting in a waiting room with blue plastic chairs, signing her name in 4 places, and receiving a sheet of paper printed in black ink, stating that the debt in Deirdre Keene's name had been paid in full and the account closed. She carried the paper out of the building, walked 2 blocks, then stopped at a street corner and read it once more in the daylight. 4 years. She folded it into quarters, slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, and went home. That evening, she cooked noodles, ate everything, washed the bowl, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall across from her, until darkness had fully settled. On Wednesday, she began looking for work. The second cleaning company she called had an opening on the night shift, and on Friday, she started working in an 11-story office building on West Adams Street, from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, for a contractor called Bradley Building Services. This time, there was an employment contract, a Form W-2, and insurance coverage beginning after 90 days. She was assigned supply cart number 4. She vacuumed the rows of desks on the 7th floor, emptied the trash, wiped down the kitchen counters in the employee break room, and cleaned both sides of the hallway windows from one end to the other. She worked quickly and thoroughly, and during her first week, the crew supervisor told her that almost no one managed to finish the 7th floor before 4 o'clock in the morning. Everything was exactly as it had been before. The same kind of yellow plastic bucket with 2 compartments. The same ammonia-scented glass cleaner that clung to her hands no matter how much she washed them. The same feeling of walking past 2 security guards talking in the lobby without either of them pausing in the middle of a sentence. She returned to her room at 7 o'clock in the morning, drew the curtains, slept until 3 in the afternoon, woke, ate, then left for work again. She called Marisol on Sunday, and the girl said she had applied to return to school for the spring semester. Hazel sent Toby a message, and he replied with a photograph of his new toolbox. No one from Lake Forest called her. There were no messages, no letters, and no more calls from unfamiliar numbers. Hazel wasn't waiting for any of those things, and she didn't tell anyone that she wasn't waiting. She had paid off the debt her mother had left behind. She had a job that came with insurance, and all her friends were in better circumstances than she was. By every measure she knew, this was the best ending a person like her had any right to hope for. Only one thing was different now. During her 4 years at the Verona Social Club, she had never known that there were rooms where people would stop talking when she entered, turn to look at her, and wait for her to speak. Now, she knew such rooms existed. And that knowledge did nothing for her, because she had already walked out of those rooms, and there was no reason for her ever to return. On the 11th day after she left Lake Forest, Hazel was sitting in the laundromat downstairs, waiting for the dryer to finish its final cycle, when the glass door opened and Claire Bennett walked in. She wore a long coat and stood in the narrow aisle between the 2 rows of machines without sitting down. She said she had been instructed to deliver a message, that she had memorized it, and that she would repeat it word for word, because that was what the person who sent it had asked her to do. Mr. Castellano invites you to return. Not as an employee, not as repayment for anything. The car will wait here until you decide. The choice is yours. When Claire finished, she fell silent. She didn't add a single word of her own, didn't offer advice, and didn't urge Hazel one way or the other. Hazel watched the dryer turn through its final 4 minutes. She folded her clothes, placed them in the cloth bag, carried them upstairs, and set them on the bed. She stood in the middle of the room for about a minute. Then she took her coat, locked the door, and went down to the alley. The car was still parked there, and Claire opened the rear door for her. The road north was quieter in the gathering dusk than it had been on the day Hazel left. When they arrived, it wasn't Renner who opened the door. Claire led her through the foyer, up to the 2nd floor, then turned into a side corridor Hazel had never entered during all the time she had worked there. At the end of that corridor was a narrow wooden staircase leading to the attic. Claire stopped at the foot of the stairs and said he was upstairs. Hazel climbed. She counted the steps without intending to. following the habit of 11 years spent needing to remember how far she had cleaned, and she counted 31 steps. The door at the top was made of plain wood, with no carving at all, unlike every other door in the house. Beyond it was a room with a low ceiling, an old desk, 2 chairs, a floor lamp, and a small window overlooking the dark lake. Raymond stood beside the window with his back to her. The bandage had been removed from his left hand, leaving only a thin piece of gauze taped across the back of it. He heard her enter but didn't turn around immediately. "Sit down," he said. Hazel sat in the chair nearest the door. He turned, pulled out the other chair, and sat across from her with both elbows resting on his knees. He looked down at the floor for a while before he began. "There's something I haven't told anyone," he said. "Not even Renner. I was conscious that entire night. From beginning to end, the door frame came down, broke 2 of my ribs, and pinned my leg. But I didn't lose consciousness for even a second. I heard the metal bar being threaded through the door handles upstairs. I even heard it scrape against the wall as someone pressed it tight. Then I heard the footsteps moving away. The left foot was heavier than the right." He paused. "I knew exactly who it was. I knew at that moment, not sometime later, and I knew something else. No one was coming down. My men were outside in the parking lot. I had ordered them to remain outside all evening." He lifted his eyes. "So I stopped pushing against the doorframe. I lay there and accepted it. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I didn't pray. I wasn't afraid. I didn't think about anyone at all. I simply lay there, calculated how many minutes I had left, and decided it was fair. 38 years of doing the things I've done, and a woman I married had decided that enough was enough. I thought it was fair." Hazel said nothing. Then I heard the metal bar fall. Then I heard footsteps running down the stairs. Then 2 hands seized me by the collar, and a voice ordered me to get up. He looked directly at her. "You didn't ask my name. You didn't ask whether I was all right. You didn't beg me to keep trying. You gave me orders. You told me to get up right now. You told me you couldn't lift me. You told me I had to push myself up. And I got to my feet because no one had spoken to me in that voice in 20 years. He straightened in his chair. "I have about 30 men willing to die for me, and I believe they mean it. But not one of them could have done what you did that night, because every one of them would have asked me first, and I would have told them to leave me there. But you didn't ask me a single question." He placed both hands on his knees. "Since you left, I've had 7 meetings in 1 week, and I've sat through 7 men telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. Then I came home and thought about a woman standing at the door of my study, reading 11 names aloud to me without asking for a single cent for herself. I didn't call you back here because I owe you my life. I've already repaid that debt with money, and you accepted it, and that matter is finished. I called you back because I want you to stay. Not as a cleaner, not as a guest. Stay so I can come to know the kind of person you are, over time, and through the choices you make at every step. You have the right to say no, and if you say no, the car will take you home, and no one will ever bother you again." Hazel remained silent for a long while. "Will you give me one day, sir?" she asked. "Yes," he answered at once, and he didn't ask another question. Hazel gave him her answer the following afternoon, and she gave it to him with a list. She said she would stay, but she wanted 3 things. First, she would apply to complete the final 2 semesters of her nursing degree at Loyola, beginning with the spring semester in January, and she would pay the tuition herself out of her salary. She wouldn't accept a scholarship from any fund connected to him. Second, she wanted to keep her night job on West Adams Street until classes began, because she had signed a contract, and she didn't walk away from a job halfway through. Third, if the day ever came when she wanted to leave, she would leave, and no one would ask her why. Raymond listened to all 3 conditions and agreed, bargaining over only one point. If she attended classes at night, someone had to drive her there and bring her home. She agreed. In January, she returned to a classroom after 4 years and 3 months, sitting in the second row of a class where most of the students were 6 or 7 years younger than she was, and during the first week, she had to relearn how to take notes quickly. She registered for clinical rotations on Tuesday and Thursday mornings at a hospital on the west side of the city. She still woke early. She still cleaned her own room. The house, however, took longer to grow accustomed to her. During the first 3 months, what Hazel Keene had become was discussed in dining rooms where she wasn't invited. 3 other families in the city heard about it, and each household told the story differently. One said the Castellano boss had taken in a cleaning girl, because she had saved him, the way a man might pick up a stray dog. Another said it was dangerous because the girl knew too much. At the first death anniversary observance for a man in the organization, Hazel was seated at a table with the wives of 2 capos. The 2 women talked to each other throughout the entire meal without asking Hazel a single question, and when they stood to leave, one of them glanced at her exactly once, with the look someone might give a stain on a tablecloth, a look that held no anger, and merely acknowledged that something was present that had no business being there. Hazel nodded politely to her and walked away. She heard the words, "Maid girl," at least 4 times that winter, once from less than 10 feet away. She never responded. She had spent 11 years living in a state where people spoke in front of her as though they were speaking in front of a chair. And the only difference now was that they knew she could hear them and spoke anyway. She didn't tell Raymond about any of it, and he didn't ask. But by February, those 2 women were no longer seated at the same table with her, and Hazel understood that someone had rearranged the seating without offering anyone an explanation. Silas Renner didn't say a word to her during the first 3 weeks. He nodded when he passed her in the hallway, opened doors when her arms were full of books, and did nothing more. Then, one evening, near the end of January, as she was putting her books into her bag in the foyer before leaving for class, he walked past, stopped, and said exactly one sentence. "You were right to make him rest for 2 more days." His ribs were cracked worse than Novak dared admit. Then he continued on without waiting for her to answer. From that day forward, he called her Miss Keene instead of girl. Claire Bennett was much simpler about it. She began leaving a plate of dinner for Hazel in the warming oven whenever Hazel came home late after a clinical shift, and by March, the 2 women had fallen into the habit of sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea at 11 o'clock at night. Claire told her the small stories of the household that no one ever told anyone, while Hazel told her about her shifts at the hospital. One evening, Claire asked whether she was afraid. Hazel thought for a moment, then said what frightened her most was the day she became accustomed to all of this. Raymond met with her every evening whenever he was home. They sat in the attic room, she doing her coursework while he read documents, and on some nights, they exchanged no more than 10 sentences. He asked about her clinical rotations. She asked him about things she didn't understand. One evening, he showed her a file on an Indiana trucking company he had recently purchased in full, and another concerning 3 riverside parcels on the southwest side that had been transferred to a construction company legally registered in its owner's name. He didn't explain why he was showing them to her. She didn't ask. But over those 6 months, there were 4 investments like that. All of them clean businesses. All of them handled slowly and quietly, and Raymond made no announcement about any of them to anyone in his organization. During meetings, he still sat at the head of the table, and still made every decision in 3 or 4 words, just as he always had. Only 2 people in the house noticed that the money was beginning to flow in a different direction. One was Renner. The other sat in the attic room every evening with a textbook open across her lap. That was how the winter passed. By March, Farrow had returned from Rockford. They brought him in on Thursday afternoon, without handcuffs, without men flanking him on either side, with only a car pulling up in front of the house, and Renner walking 3 steps behind him. Vincent Farrow was 63 years old, and walked with a slight limp because of the knee surgery he'd had 2 years earlier, and he entered the second-floor study with the bearing of a man who had passed through that door several thousand times. Raymond rose when he came in. He pulled out a chair for him, poured him a glass of whiskey, and asked how his knee had been lately. Farrow said it ached when the weather turned cold. Raymond said then he shouldn't go to Rockford in March anymore. They spoke that way for about 3 minutes. About the weather, about Farrow's youngest son working in Phoenix, about a restaurant on Taylor Street that had just closed after 40 years. Then Raymond placed the file on the desk, pushed it toward the old man, and sat down. Farrow didn't open it. He looked at the cover for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Go ahead and ask," he said. "The cameras," Raymond said. "I shut them down," Farrow replied. 10:41. I was sitting in my car in the north lot, and I shut them down with my phone. I turned off 4 of them, the service hallway, the basement landing, the east side door, and the one by the garbage truck entrance. The one at the garbage truck entrance went down a few minutes late, so that must be how the boy ended up on the footage. The money. 2.3 million. 4 payments, just as it says in there. Farrow tipped his chin toward the file. "I'm not going to deny it. I'm old now. I don't have the strength to deny it. Raymond gave a single nod. Did you know I was down there? Farrow remained silent for about 5 seconds. Yes, he said. I knew. Raymond didn't ask why. That was what Renner later recounted, and could never understand, that Raymond hadn't asked a single question about the reason. Hadn't asked whether it was for money or revenge, hadn't asked what had become of 35 years. He simply moved to the next question on his list. Who paid you? Farrow looked at him for a long time. Then he laughed, a dry sound that broke from somewhere deep in his chest, brief and utterly without humor. You still think it was Kovac, he said. For 9 years, you've been looking in the wrong direction. There were 3 men in the room, and all 3 heard those words. Raymond showed no reaction. He waited. I'll tell you, Farrow said, but not now. I want 2 things. Say them. A lawyer, not one of the family's people, an outsider of my choosing, and I want him sitting beside me when I speak, and I want everything I say put into a written statement bearing my signature, because what I'm about to reveal will die with me if the only witnesses are the mouths in this room. He took a sip of whiskey. Second, Angela. She knows nothing. For 31 years, she hasn't known a thing. I want your promise that no matter where this leads, no one will touch her, and she'll keep the house. Raymond looked at him. All right, he said. Both. Farrow set down his glass. You promised too quickly. You know I don't go back on my word. Yes, Farrow said. I know. Raymond called Renner in and told him to have the lawyer there at 9 o'clock the following morning, in the first-floor conference room, with someone present to record the meeting and take minutes. Then he told him to have the car take Mr. Farrow home. Renner opened his mouth as if to say something, but Raymond gave him a look, and Renner closed it again. 2 men outside the gate, Raymond said. They don't go inside the house. He sleeps in his own bed tonight. Farrow rose, and when he reached the door, he stopped and turned to look at Raymond once. He said nothing. Then he left. At 9 o'clock the following morning, the lawyer arrived on time and waited in the first-floor conference room for 40 minutes. At 9:40, the gate guard called the house. Vincent Farrow had been found by his wife in the study of their home in Elmwood Park, sitting in his chair with the light still on. The ambulance had arrived at 9:12. The Cook County medical examiner concluded that the cause of death was an acute myocardial infarction. Farrow had a 10-year history of coronary artery disease and a valid prescription. There were no signs of external force, no foreign substances in his blood, no weapon, and no evidence of forced entry. Nothing was missing from the house. By noon, the entire organization had reached its conclusion. Kovac had silenced Farrow before he could talk, everyone said, and the explanation made so much sense that no one bothered to look any further. Hazel heard about it at 4 o'clock that afternoon, when she returned from her clinical rotation and Claire told her at the kitchen table. That evening, she sat in the attic room, while Raymond left open on the desk a packet of documents Renner had brought back, including the scene report, the preliminary findings, and a copy of the entry log from the security gate of the Elmwood Park residential community, where every visitor was required to present identification and sign in. Hazel didn't read the findings. She turned to the final page and read the gridded table from top to bottom, exactly as she had read her crew's timesheets for 4 straight years. Between 7 o'clock the previous evening and midnight, only 1 visitor had entered the entire community, recorded as arriving at 9:17 and leaving at 9:52. The registered name belonged to a woman, and beside it, in accordance with procedure, the security station had photographed both her identification and the person standing at the barrier. Hazel looked at the name, then she looked at the photograph. She sat motionless for a very long time, and she said nothing to Raymond that night. The offer arrived during the 2nd week of April, and it came in a way no one in the house had anticipated. Not through an intermediary, and not at midnight. An ordinary letter arrived by mail at the Castellano Holdings office in the Loop, signed by Emil Kovac, requesting a meeting in broad daylight at a location chosen by the Castellano side, with each party permitted to bring 2 people, while he would also bring his personal attorney. Renner said it was a trap. Raymond read the letter twice, then said that if Kovac wanted to kill him, he wouldn't have written a letter. The meeting took place at 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, in the first-floor conference room of the Lake Forest House, with the curtains drawn open and the door left ajar. Emil Kovac was 52 years old, short and broad-shouldered, and he moved slowly, like a man who had lived for years with chronic back pain. He shook Raymond's hand before sitting down. He didn't begin with a threat. I didn't come here to discuss business, Kovac said. I came to tell you something to your face, in broad daylight, with my attorney sitting here as a witness. Because if I don't say it, 6 months from now, the two sides of us will have lost about 40 men, and I have no need for that. He placed a file on the table and pushed it across. Open it. There were 3 things inside the file. The first was a copy of a property agreement signed 9 years earlier between the Castellano and Ashford families, clearly stating the capital the Ashford family had contributed when the marriage was established, including shares in 3 trucking companies and a stretch of warehouses along the Calumet River, along with a clause stipulating that if Mrs. Vivian Ashford Castellano died without an heir, all of that capital would pass permanently to the Castellano side. The second was a statement of transactions from the previous 14 months, showing that Castellano Holdings had quietly purchased 4 legitimate assets, including a trucking company in Indiana and 3 riverside parcels, all paid for with funds, Kovac said, couldn't be explained by the company's ordinary business operations. The third was a single-page typed letter with no signature, printed on Castellano Holdings letterhead and addressed to V. Farrow. It spoke briefly of handling the Verona matter on October 17th, instructed him to shut down the surveillance system in the eastern sector, beginning at 10:40 p.m., and told him to ensure that no one from the family was present in that area. In the lower right corner of the letter was a raised seal pressed into the paper, bearing the image of an eagle, the official seal of Castellano Holdings. Kovac allowed him to finish reading everything. I've been thinking about this for 3 weeks, he said, and I'm going to tell you what I see. You married that woman 9 years ago, not because you wanted to, but because your father had just died and you needed to stop a war. 9 years later, you were powerful enough that you no longer needed that agreement, but you couldn't divorce her, because a divorce would return that capital to the Ashford family and cost you an entire stretch of warehouses. Death was different. If she died, it all belonged to you. You chose a night when there were 300 guests in the building. You chose a man who had stood beside your father for 35 years to do the dirty work. And you chose Bridgeport, a 20-minute drive from my territory, so that when the police started looking, they would look in my direction. He tapped one finger against the file. Only one part went wrong. That doorframe fell on you. You hadn't planned for that, and you very nearly died. And that's the only reason I'm sitting here talking to you instead of handling this another way. Because a man staging the whole thing himself doesn't arrange to have 2 of his ribs broken. He paused. Then there was Farrow. 3 weeks ago, he asked for an attorney so he could give a statement. The following morning, he died in a chair inside his own home, exactly 40 minutes before the appointment, and the official finding said it was his heart. My people didn't go to Elmwood Park. I had no one there. I gave no such order. You can believe that or not, but I know I didn't do it, so that leaves one person with a reason to silence him. Raymond had remained still from the beginning. He didn't interrupt once. He didn't strike the table, didn't sneer, and didn't summon anyone into the room. When Kovac finished speaking, Raymond turned back to the page bearing the raised seal, placed it separately to one side, and stared at it for about 10 seconds. Are you finished? He said. Almost, Kovac replied. He braced both hands on the table and rose slowly. That short man standing in a room filled with people who could kill him in 2 seconds, yet his voice never grew louder. I won't go to war with you over something I didn't do, he said. That's what I told my people, and I've managed to hold them back until today. But if you killed your wife and laid it at my feet, I'll tear you down, and I'll do it slowly, and I'll begin with the legitimate assets you've just purchased. He gave Raymond a single nod. You have 7 days. I need a proper answer, something better than silence. Then he walked out. The conference room door closed behind him, and for the next 15 seconds, no one in the room dared look directly at the sheet of paper bearing the seal. That afternoon, Hazel wasn't in the conference room, and no one had told her there would be a meeting. She returned from her clinical rotation shortly before 1 o'clock, ate a quick meal in the kitchen, then carried a cloth and a spray bottle up to the mezzanine to wipe down the stair rail, because that was what she still did every Tuesday afternoon, even though no one assigned it to her anymore, and even though Claire had told her 3 times to stop. The mezzanine curved around above the conference room, separated from the space below by a row of wooden balusters, and from there, the entire length of the table was visible. She heard the door close and the sound of someone walking away, so she knew the meeting was over. She reached the bend in the railing when her hand stopped, not because she had heard anything, but because there were no voices below. She leaned forward and looked down. 4 men remained in the room, all of them standing, none of them seated, and on the table lay a single sheet of paper set apart from the file. The afternoon sunlight came through the western window and fell at an angle directly across that page. Noticing the heavy tension below, Hazel placed the spray bottle on the stair and walked down without making a sound. She stepped into the conference room and approached the table, her eyes falling on the document bearing the raised seal. She had lifted that embossing tool and set it down again every morning for nearly 5 months, and as she looked closely at the eagle pressed into the paper, she noticed the left wing formed an unbroken line without the tiny chip she knew by heart. She stopped right beside the table. Renner saw her first. He frowned and took 1 step toward her, about to tell her to leave, but Hazel caught his gaze and spoke 8 words. "The seal's fake. The left wing isn't chipped." Renner stopped. He stared at her for 2 seconds, then turned his head toward the paper on the table, walked 3 steps to Raymond, and bent down to whisper 1 brief sentence into his ear. Raymond's expression didn't change. He didn't look toward the door. He didn't look at the paper. He merely raised his eyes to Kovac, who had stopped in the middle of the room after realizing something was happening, and spoke 3 words. "We will pause." Kovac studied him for a long moment. 7 days, he said. 2 days, Raymond replied. "Stay in the city." Then he rose, picked up the paper by its edges with the tips of 2 fingers, and walked out of the room. The next 2 days were the longest the house had endured since the fire. The paper was taken to a private document examination laboratory on LaSalle Street, along with the embossing tool from the desk in the second-floor study, and Renner sat outside in the hallway for the entire first afternoon. The findings arrived on the morning of the 2nd day, 4 pages long, with the conclusion on the final page. The raised seal on the letter hadn't been made by that steel die. It had been made by another die, a reproduction that matched the original in size and composition by 98%, but differed in 3 tiny details detectable only with measuring instruments, and in 1 detail visible to the naked eye, if a person knew what to look for. The eagle's left wing on the counterfeit die formed an unbroken line. On the genuine die, there was a chip roughly 1/25 of an inch long, creating an almost imperceptible break in the outline whenever it was pressed into paper. The examiner added another paragraph at the end. Whoever had made the counterfeit die hadn't copied it from the actual object, but from an old impression that had been photographed at high resolution and reconstructed. He had determined this because the counterfeit impression contained a minute flaw at the base of the lettering beneath the eagle, the kind of flaw that appeared only when the seal was pressed into paper thicker than the standard stock. He recommended searching for the original document that had once been stamped on that kind of paper. Renner brought the examination report to the attic room that evening. Raymond read all 4 pages, set them down, and remained silent for a long while before speaking. He said the only document in that house ever sealed on paper of that weight was the property agreement signed 9 years earlier between the 2 families. There had been 2 originals. The Ashford family had kept one, and the other was inside a safe built into the wall cabinet of the primary bedroom on the 3rd floor. That safe didn't appear anywhere in the house's security records. It had been installed during his father's time. Renner asked who knew the combination. Raymond said he did. Then he fell silent for a moment, and Renner didn't ask another question because he had already worked it out. "And she did," Raymond said. He rose, walked to the small window, and stood there for a very long time with both hands braced against the sill. Hazel sat at the table with her textbook open before her, and she didn't turn a single page the entire time. When Raymond finally turned around, he spoke not to Renner, but to her. "The Elmwood Park entry log," he said. "You read it that night." Hazel closed her book. "Yes. What did you see?" She entered at 9:17 and left at 9:52. 1 visitor. The name on the register was Angela Farrow. She paused. But the woman in the photograph taken at the barrier wasn't her. It took Renner 4 days to trace the house. It stood in South Haven, Michigan, a 2.5-hour drive from Chicago, around the southern end of the lake. A 2-story wooden house rented by the season, with 6 months paid in advance by a check from a company registered in Delaware. The woman who rented it had given her name as Diane Whitlock. The neighbors said she rarely went out, walked along the water in the late afternoon, and received no mail. What Renner brought back wasn't the woman. It was 3 boxes of documents taken from the basement of that house, and what lay inside those 3 boxes overturned everything the people in the Castellano house had believed for the past 6 months. Vincent Farrow hadn't recruited anyone. He was the one who had been recruited. The first payment to him had been made 8 years and 9 months earlier, 3 months after the wedding, and it hadn't come from Kovac or from any organization on the west side. It had traveled from a private trust account opened in Ann Arbor, through 2 layers of shell companies, and then into the account of Adriatic Coastal Holdings in Malta. The owner of the original trust account was Vivian Ashford. The source of the money was the annual income she received from the very assets her family had contributed to the marriage. In other words, for 8 years and 9 months, the man who had carried Raymond Castellano in his arms when Raymond was 3 had been paid with the dowry of the wife Raymond had married in exchange for peace. The second box contained a hardcover notebook, handwritten, with most of the pages undated. Renner read it in the car on the way home, and he didn't speak for the entire journey. 4 lines appeared on the first page. September 11th, agreement signed. September 15th, meeting between the 2 families. I wasn't allowed in the room. September 22nd, asked father whether I could refuse. Father said I was the only thing our family had left to offer. October 2nd, married. Scattered throughout the notebook were brief entries separated by months, sometimes years. 14 people sat in the dining room of my own home today, and not one of them asked me a single question. The Ashford family still has 3 companies. By the end of this year, there will be 2. People call me the boss's wife. No one has called me by my name all week. Near the middle of the notebook was 1 line underlined twice. If I don't do this myself, by the time I'm 40, the Ashford name will have vanished from the map, and I'll still be sitting at the left end of the table without ever having opened my mouth. The plan was in the 3rd box, and it had been written like a business proposal. She hadn't intended to kill her husband and flee with a sum of money. She intended to make the 2 largest organizations in the region grind each other to dust. Faro had been bought 9 years earlier and left untouched for 8 years, unused, the way someone might hold a card in reserve. The fire at the Verona Club had been designed to kill Raymond and make every trace point toward Cicero. The letter bearing the counterfeit raised seal had been created to be delivered to Kovac later, ensuring that even if Raymond survived, Kovac would still have to go to war. Faro's death was the final step, silencing the only mouth that could speak her name. She would remain in the middle of it all, either as a widow or as a witness, and in either case, the Ashford capital would return to her hands under the very terms the 2 families had signed 9 years earlier. Hazel read the notebook the following evening in the attic room, slowly, from the first page to the last. When she closed it, she sat motionless for a long while. For 9 years, one woman had sat at the left end of the table in this house, and no one had ever asked what she wanted. For 11 years, another woman had knelt to scrub baseboards in rooms where people spoke in front of her as though they were speaking in front of a chair. Both women had learned the same thing, that once people stopped seeing you, you could hear everything. The only difference was what each of them chose to do with it. 3 days later, on Thursday afternoon, Hazel left the lecture hall at 4:15 and walked to the parking lot, where the driver always waited for her at the southern corner. The car had gone 2 blocks when a white van cut across the intersection at Sheridan Road and blocked them from the front, while a second stopped close behind them. There were no gunshots. No one shouted. The door beside Hazel opened, and someone spoke only one sentence, asking her to step out. The driver was held inside the car. 40 minutes later, Raymond's phone rang, and Emil Kovac was on the other end. He spoke immediately, without a greeting. His men had the girl. He didn't want to do this, but he needed a guarantee, because the Castellanos now possessed an examination report stating that the letter was counterfeit, and that could be genuine, or it could be something they had fabricated themselves to escape blame. The girl was the only living witness who had seen that woman leave the building. If Castellano gave Kovac her statement, recorded, with Kovac's attorney sitting beside her, then the matter between them would be finished. "Listen to me," Kovac said. "One maid in exchange for peace for 2,000 people. You're a businessman. You understand the arithmetic." Raymond remained silent for about 3 seconds. "She has a name," he said. "Hazel Keene. And no." The warehouse stood in Whiting, Indiana, at the edge of the lake, one of a row of old corrugated metal buildings in an industrial district abandoned long ago. They took Hazel into a small room in the corner, furnished with an iron table and 2 plastic chairs, then closed the door and left her sitting there for nearly an hour. When the door opened a second time, the person who entered was a woman with closely cropped hair, glasses, and a gray coat. She sat down in the chair across from Hazel, placed both hands on the table, and studied her for a long while before speaking. "I know you," Vivian said. I walked past you that night. Hazel didn't answer. I walked past you many times before that too, she continued. For 4 years. I attended parties at that club at least a dozen times, and you were there every time, and I never once saw you until the night you stood in the middle of that hallway. She removed her glasses and placed them on the table. Do you think you're so different from me? You cleaned his house too. You sat in places where no one ever asked you a single question. For 9 years, I sat at that dining table, and no one called me by my name. They called me the boss's wife. That was all. Hazel looked at her. You're right, she said. I cleaned his house too. I stood in the corner of rooms for 11 years. The only difference between you and me is that when I saw someone dying at the foot of a staircase, I pulled that person out. Vivian said nothing more. She put her glasses back on, and during that silence, the sound of tires grinding over gravel came from the yard outside. Raymond entered through the main door alone, his hands empty, carrying nothing, and stopped in the middle of the warehouse. The condition he had given over the phone was simple. When he walked in, the girl walked out, and he would bring no one with him. What he hadn't said was that Renner and 4 of his men had been lying on the northern metal roof for the past 20 minutes. Hazel was led to the door. She stopped there and turned to look back inside. Vivian had risen from the table, and she held a handgun aimed at Raymond from about 13 feet away. Hazel could see clearly that she was waiting for something. She was waiting for him to soften his voice. She was waiting for him to ask why, waiting for him to remind her of everything he had done for her, waiting for him to say that he had given her everything. After 9 years of sitting at the left end of that table, perhaps she had played this moment in her mind hundreds of times. Raymond did none of those things. He stood still, looked directly at her, and asked one question. 9 years, he said. What did you want? I'm asking you this one time, and I'll listen to all of it. Vivian didn't answer. Hazel saw the hand holding the gun begin to tremble, very slightly at first, beginning at the wrist and spreading into her fingers. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then the gun lowered about 8 inches, and in that instant, one of Renner's men stepped forward from behind her and took it from her hand as simply as taking a cup from someone drifting to sleep. Not a single shot was fired. Vivian sat down in the plastic chair and offered no resistance at all. There were 9 men inside the warehouse then, and every one of them turned toward Raymond and waited. Hazel knew exactly what they were waiting for. She walked back inside. If this ends here, she said, there won't be any record. No official report, no trial, nothing at all. And Rosa Delgado will forever remain nothing more than an undocumented cleaning worker who died in a fire of unknown cause. Her name never appeared in any system while she was alive. If you handle this here, her name won't appear in the final one either. She looked at Raymond. Let the court decide. Let someone read her name aloud in a courtroom. That's the one thing she was never allowed to have while she was alive. Raymond looked at her for a very long time. Then he turned to Renner and told him to call the Indiana State Police. 3 weeks later, Raymond's attorney walked into the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, carrying 14 boxes of documents, including evidence that proved his own client's crimes. Raymond signed a cooperation and deferred prosecution agreement, accepted the forfeiture of 2/3 of his assets, agreed to 5 years of federal supervision, and transferred everything that remained into legitimate transportation, construction, and real estate businesses. Vivian Ashford Castellano was prosecuted in Cook County State Court for murder and aggravated arson. The trial lasted 11 days, and throughout those proceedings, Rosa Delgado's name was read aloud 37 times. Marisol sat in the front row and listened to all 37. Emil Kovac withdrew without going to war, and neither side lost a single man. Toby Marsh completed his refrigeration training and earned his professional license. Silas Renner called her Miss Keene for an entire year. And then one day, he called her Hazel. Hazel Keene passed her nursing licensure examination at the age of 29. The Verona Club was rebuilt on the same ground where it had once stood, but it didn't reopen as a club. It was named the Rosa Delgado Center, and it had a free clinic, evening English classes, and a legal office dedicated to cases involving service workers whose wages had been stolen, who had been forced to work without contracts, or who had been injured with no one willing to accept responsibility. Hazel ran it. She and Raymond were married there on an October afternoon, exactly 2 years after the night of the fire, with 40 guests, most of whom had once held a broom in their hands. This story leaves us with something very simple. Never measure a person's worth by the work they're doing. Measure it by what they do when no one is watching and when they have nothing to gain. That night, the most powerful man in the city lay at the foot of a staircase, and the only person still standing was a cleaning woman whose name didn't appear on the payroll. And if there is someone around you whom you have grown accustomed to treating as though they don't exist, the person who cleans your workplace, the security guard in the lobby, or the delivery worker who comes to your door every day, then please call that person by name today, just once. Sometimes being called by one's rightful name is all a person needs to keep from ever becoming your enemy and to believe they still have value. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that every day we can continue listening to more meaningful stories. How did this story make you feel? And is there someone in your life who is being treated as though they're invisible? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always enjoy good health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.